We need to pass a resolution condemning what Russia has done in Crimea and threatens to do in Ukraine. They have gathered at the borders in Belarus and in Russia on the eastern reaches of Ukraine, military forces far beyond what was necessary to guarantee an orderly referendum in Crimea a little over 9 days ago. They are poised to move forward, and I pray that they won't. We've got to make it clear in the West, whether it's President Obama's visit with the G7 nations, whether it's the European Union in resolution, or even our Senate and House, that we stand with Ukraine. We want to stand by their sovereign and territorial integrity. Mr. President, many people didn't notice, they should have, but in 1994, Ukraine was the third strongest nuclear power in the world. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had more nuclear weapons than any country on earth save the United States and Russia. In 1994, they came forward and said, we are prepared to eliminate, destroy our nuclear arsenal if we have the assurance of major nations that this won't jeopardize our future. It won't jeopardize our territorial integrity. They produced what was known as the Budapest Memorandum. And this Budapest Memorandum was signed by the United States, the United Kingdom, Ukraine, and Russia, guaranteeing that, at least in principle, they would respect, all those nations would respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Well, within the last 2 weeks, Russia has not only reneged on that promise, it has in fact invaded Ukraine and taken over territory there. It is important for us, when it comes to Ukraine, to not only stand by the Ukrainian people as they move toward a more democratic form of government. It is important for us to reinforce the premise that if a country will give up its nuclear weapons, will not pursue the development of nuclear weapons and becoming part of the nuclear club, that we will basically say that will not create a dangerous situation for your future. That's what the Budapest Agreement was about, recently violated by Russia, one of the signatories. Well, if we want to make the argument in Iran, North Korea, other countries, that they should forswear their nuclear weapons, shouldn't we also be standing by the premise that if they do it, at least civilized nations will stand behind them if they are threatened and their sovereignty is threatened? And that's what's happening today in Ukraine, in Crimea. Not just a question of the survival of the Ukrainian government, but also a question as to whether or not civilized countries around the world, trying to lessen the threat of nuclear weapons, will stand with one voice and condemn the Russians for what they have done. It is very clear that Putin has ambitions far beyond the Republic of Georgia and far beyond Ukraine. He engaged in this charm offensive at the Sochi Olympics, talked about the modern Russia and what it meant in the 21st century. And the very same troops that were protecting the athletes from terrorism in Sochi, as soon as the final ceremony ended, were shifted and transferred into Crimea to invade that nation. The charm offensive was clearly over. NBC may have covered the Sochi Olympics. It didn't cover the invasion of Crimea in real time, but it happened, and we know it happened. Having been to Ukraine with Senator McCain and 6 other colleagues, our bipartisan delegation found that there is a deep attachment in Ukraine to the United States. It is an attachment that is sometimes linked to specific families. I happen to represent the city of Chicago, where there is a prominent section known as Ukrainian Village. And when I returned from Ukraine and went back to this section of Chicago near the church where the Ukrainians worship on Sunday, we had over 500 people who gathered to hear what I'd seen and heard and talk about where we should go when it came to the future of Ukraine. But it's worthy of note that just weren't Ukrainian Americans in that room in Chicago when I returned a week ago. In the front row were Polish people, and we have more Poles in Chicago than almost any other city outside of the nation of Poland. Lithuanians, Latvians, Georgians, even Venezuelans. And they had all come there to listen carefully, many of them with memories that not that long ago they were under Soviet domination and lived in fear of what would come from Moscow. These same people were standing together. They were standing in league with their Ukrainian American neighbors. with the understanding that throughout its modern history, Russia and the Soviet Union have taken over countries nearby when they could, and many times we didn't speak out. I've heard the argument made that perhaps the United States, if it showed more military force in other places in the world, we might have discouraged Vladimir Putin. That argument doesn't make sense. Look at history. We were in the midst of the Vietnam War. We had committed 500,000 troops. The greatest military in the world was engaged in Southeast Asia when Brezhnev, the head of the Soviet Union, invaded Czechoslovakia. We were engaged in 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, actively showing the power of our military in those countries under President George W. Bush when Vladimir Putin invaded the Republic of Georgia. So I think it's an empty argument that says if we just show our muscles and start a war someplace, the rest of the world will be fearful. It didn't work in those 2 instances. I don't think it's a recipe for the future. What the president is trying to do is establish political and economic sanctions on Russia that will cost their economy, put pressure on them to stop this aggressive conduct. That, to me, is sensible. Let's take up this measure. If members have amendments, bring them to the floor. Let's pass it today, not later this week. Let's show that we stand with the Ukrainians and oppose Russian aggression, support sanctions when needed, and are prepared to loan to the Ukrainians the money that they need to sustain their economy and to build it in the future. Ukraine is the 2nd largest country in Europe. It is moving toward the West. Let us welcome them. As long as they are going to make certain their future is consistent with our democratic values, I think it's important that we not only continue this dialogue, but show that we can truly be their allies and friends. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.